Richard Sterling lived his life like a perfectly written line of code. Clean, efficient, and without a single unnecessary element. His house, a sprawling mansion of glass and sharp-edged marble, was a monument to this philosophy. There were no messy piles of mail, no stray shoes by the door, no family photos cluttering the sleek surfaces. Everything had its place. Every moment of his day was scheduled, from his 5 a.m. workout to his 10 p.m. review of global market trends. He had built a tech empire from the ground up by finding the most logical, most streamlined solution to any problem. He was a man who believed that with enough data and enough resources, any variable could be controlled, but for 21 straight days, his world had been hijacked by a chaotic, unpredictable, and utterly uncontrollable variable, the sound of his 3-month-old son. Leo, crying. It wasn't just the usual fussiness of a newborn. This was something else entirely. It was a high, piercing wail that seemed to vibrate in the bones of the house. It was a sound that cut through the triple-paned glass and the state-of-the-art soundproofing like a hot knife through butter. It started without warning, often in the dead of night, and could go on for hours, sometimes with only a few minutes of exhausted, ragged breathing in between. It was a sound that made Richard's teeth ache and his chest feel tight with a helpless kind of panic. At first, he had approached the problem like he would any other business challenge. He gathered data. He logged the crying episodes, noting the time, the duration, and Leo's last feeding. He created spreadsheets and cross-referenced them with the temperature in the nursery and the barometric pressure outside. The data told him nothing other than that his son was miserable. His next step was to consult the top experts. He flew in a team of pediatricians from a renowned children's hospital. They ran every test imaginable. They pricked Leo's tiny heels for blood samples. They hooked him up to gentle monitors. They peered into his ears and throat. After 2 days of observation, the lead doctor, a woman with a kind face and tired eyes, gave Richard the report. "Mr. Sterling," she had said gently, "medically your son is perfect. He's healthy, strong, and gaining weight beautifully. There is no physical reason we can find for this distress." Richard had felt a brief flicker of relief, which was instantly extinguished by a colder, deeper fear. If it wasn't a medical problem he could fix, then what was it? He thanked the doctors and saw them out, their professional calm a stark contrast to the storm raging inside his home. The moment the door closed, Leo's cries started up again, a tiny, furious siren signaling that the problem was far from solved. His next move was to acquire the best human resource for the job. He hired a renowned baby whisperer from Switzerland, a woman who came with glowing testimonials from royalty and celebrities. She arrived with a calm smile and a bag full of strange, soft cloths and herbal oils. Richard watched her work, observing her techniques. She swaddled Leo with expert precision. She shushed him with a rhythmic hiss that sounded like the ocean. She swayed in a slow, hypnotic dance. For a few precious moments, it seemed to work. Leo's cries would soften into whimpers, and Richard would feel a surge of hope. But then, just as the baby seemed on the verge of sleep, his face would crumple again, and the wailing would return, louder and more desperate than before. After 48 hours without a break, the baby whisperer finally emerged from the nursery, her own eyes red-rimmed and her confident smile gone. "I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice trembling. I cannot help him." She looked as defeated as he felt. 3 nannies followed. The first was a sturdy, experienced woman who had raised 5 children of her own. She lasted 3 days before she told Richard's assistant that the sound was unnatural, and she couldn't take it anymore. The second was a younger woman, full of modern techniques and positive energy. She quit after a week, looking hollowed out. The third, a grandmotherly type who promised she could soothe any baby, simply packed her bag one afternoon while Richard was on a conference call, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "I'm sorry." With his human resources failing him, Richard turned to what he knew best: technology. He ordered everything he could find that promised a quiet baby. A smart cradle that mimicked the motion and heartbeat of a mother arrived, a gleaming white pod that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. He placed Leo inside, but the baby's frantic cries only seemed to bounce off the smooth plastic. He bought a top-of-the-line white noise machine that could play everything from gentle rain to a mother's heartbeat. He tried every setting, but the synthesized sounds were no match for the raw, real noise of his son's distress. He even had a special, hypoallergenic formula shipped from a lab in Denmark, created to be the most easily digestible food on the planet. Leo drank it, but the crying continued. Now Richard was alone. It was late, and the house was dark and silent except for the crying. He had sent his housekeeper home hours ago, unable to bear the look of pity in her eyes. He walked through the vast, empty rooms of his mansion, a place that was supposed to be his sanctuary but now felt like a prison. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed a perfectly manicured lawn under the moonlight, a scene of order and peace that felt like a cruel joke. He walked into his home office, a room that usually gave him a sense of power. On his massive monitor, stock tickers crawled silently, representing the billions of dollars he had made by solving complex problems. But none of that money, none of that success, could silence the sound coming from the room down the hall. He sank into his expensive leather chair and put his head in his hands. He was exhausted in a way he had never been before. It wasn't just a lack of sleep. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He was a man who had always had the answer, the plan, the solution. Now he had nothing. He looked at a framed photo on his desk, one of the few personal items in the room. It was a picture of him holding Leo for the first time in the hospital. In the photo, Richard was looking down at the tiny, blanketed bundle with an expression of awe and wonder he didn't know he was capable of. He loved his son more than he had ever thought possible. That love made the current situation even more agonizing. He felt like a failure. He could build an empire, but he couldn't comfort his own child. The crying continued, a relentless, heartbreaking sound that filled the perfect silent house, reminding him that for the first time in his life, he was facing a problem that money and logic couldn't solve. On the other side of a tall, perfectly trimmed hedge, a world away in feeling but only a few feet in distance, was a small, weathered bungalow. The paint on the window frames was peeling, and the tiny porch was cluttered with a pair of muddy boots and a stack of old flower pots. This was the home of Sam, an 11-year-old boy who was as quiet and thoughtful as the house he lived in was full of life. While his father worked as the gardener for the big house next door, Sam would often find a quiet spot under an old oak tree in their own small yard, a worn sketchbook in his lap. He didn't draw big, exciting things. He drew the way a leaf curled as it dried, the intricate pattern on a ladybug's back, or the busy, determined path of an ant across the pavement. For the past few weeks, his peaceful world had a soundtrack, and it was one he didn't like. It was the sound of a baby crying. It wasn't the fussy on and off crying he was used to hearing from his baby cousin when she needed a nap or was hungry. This was different. It was a thin, sharp wail that held a note of pure desperation, a sound that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It would start suddenly, cutting through the afternoon birdsong or the quiet hum of the evening, and it would drill into his ears, making it hard to concentrate on his drawings from his spot under the oak tree. Sam had a clear view of the back of the Sterling mansion. He had been watching a strange, silent play unfold over there. He saw the expensive, shiny cars pull up the long driveway, driven by serious-faced men and women in stiff clothes. They would go inside, and for a little while, nothing would change. Then they would come back out, often looking tired or confused, shake the rich man's hand and drive away. He saw 3 different women come to take care of the baby, each one looking hopeful on the first day and looking beaten and exhausted on the last. The last one, a kind-looking woman with gray hair, had simply walked off the property one afternoon with her bag, not even waiting to say goodbye. The main character in this strange play, of course, was the man who owned the big house. Mr. Sterling. Sam had seen him plenty of times. Usually, he moved with a quick, confident stride, his phone pressed to his ear, his face set in a look of intense focus. He was a man who seemed to be in charge of everything. But lately, he had become a different person. Sam would watch him pace back and forth on his perfectly manicured lawn, His shoulders slumped, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and loose on his frame. One afternoon, Sam saw him step out onto the stone patio, not with his usual proud stride, but with a slow, heavy shuffle. He didn't look at his perfect garden or his sparkling pool. He just stood there, staring out at nothing, his whole body looking like it had been drained of all its energy. He ran his hands through his hair again and again, a gesture of pure frustration that Sam understood even without hearing the words. The crying was the worst part. It was a constant, mournful sound that seemed to soak into the perfect sterile walls of the mansion. Sam would look at the huge glass house so clean and empty, and then he would look at his own small, messy home, and he couldn't understand it. His own house was never truly quiet. In the morning, there was the gurgle of the coffee pot and the sound of his mother humming an old tune as she made breakfast. During the day, the radio was always on in the kitchen, playing soft music. There was the clatter of pans, the rumble of the washing machine in the next room, and the distant sound of traffic from the street. It was a gentle, constant symphony of everyday life. He remembered when his baby cousin was staying with them last month. She was a fussy baby too, but when she started to cry, his mother wouldn't panic. She would just pick her up, hold her close, and bounce her gently as she stirred a pot on the stove or folded laundry. The baby would be nestled against her shoulder, hearing the steady beat of her heart, feeling the warmth of her body, and listening to the low, familiar sounds of the house. More often than not, she would calm down and drift off to sleep, right there in the middle of all the gentle chaos. Sam thought about the big house next door. It was so quiet. Too quiet. When the baby wasn't crying, there was nothing. No humming, no clattering, no radio. It was like a museum, not a home. He imagined the baby lying in a fancy crib in a perfectly silent room, with nothing to listen to but his own cries echoing back at him. It felt lonely. The crying didn't sound angry anymore, not to Sam. It sounded sad. It sounded like a tiny, lonely voice calling out for something, anything to connect with in that vast, quiet space. He closed his sketchbook, the drawing of the ant forgotten. He looked at the huge glass house, a monument to order and control, and he felt a pang of pity, not just for the crying baby, but for the sad man who lived inside. The man had all the money in the world. He could buy anything, but he couldn't buy the simple, rumbling comfort of a home that was truly lived in. Sam didn't know what the answer was. He was just a kid who liked to draw bugs. But as he sat there, listening to the heartbreaking wail drift across the hedge, a powerful thought took root in his mind. The problem wasn't that the house was too loud. It was that it was too quiet. The baby wasn't crying because of something that was there. He was crying because of everything that was missing. The afternoon sun was warm on the back of Sam's neck, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the strange drama playing out in the garden next door. His father was on his hands and knees, carefully weeding a flower bed that bordered the pristine stone patio of the Sterling mansion. His father worked with a quiet, steady rhythm, his hands moving skillfully among the vibrant roses, pulling out the unwanted invaders without disturbing a single precious petal. It was work his father had done for years, a silent, respectful dance in the shadow of the great house. Sam sat nearby on the grass, pretending to read a book. But his eyes were fixed on the patio doors for the last hour. The baby's cries had been particularly sharp, a relentless, high-pitched siren that seemed to be coming from right inside the walls. It was a sound that made you feel uneasy deep down in your stomach, a sound of pure, unfiltered distress. Sam watched his father's shoulders tense slightly with each wail, but the man never stopped working. He was a professional, and he had learned long ago to keep his focus on his own patch of ground. No matter what was happening in the big house, then something happened. The heavy glass patio door, which was always shut so tightly it seemed to be part of the wall, was thrown open. It wasn't opened with purpose, but stumbled against as if someone was fleeing from something inside. Richard Sterling practically fell out onto the patio. He looked like a completely different man from the one who usually strode across his lawn with a phone glued to his ear. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his collar was undone, and his hair, usually so perfectly in place, was sticking up in every direction. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a kind of frantic exhaustion. He didn't seem to know where he was going. He just moved away from the open door as if the house itself were on fire. The moment the door was open, the baby's crying changed. It was no longer muffled by glass and walls. It burst out into the fresh, sunny air, raw and piercing. It filled the perfect, quiet garden, a sound of pure agony that clashed horribly with the beauty of the roses and the neat green lawn. It was so loud, so real, that it felt like a physical presence. Richard Sterling took a few unsteady steps across the patio, his hand outstretched as if to steady himself on nothing at all. Then he just collapsed. He didn't fall down, but he sank onto a sleek, modern bench as if his bones had suddenly turned to water. He leaned forward, putting his head in his hands, and his whole body seemed to shrink. From where he was sitting, Sam could see the man's shoulders shaking, and for a moment he thought he was crying. Too, Sam's father had stopped working. He was still on his knees, but his hands were frozen in the dirt. He looked up, saw the state of his boss, and quickly looked back down, pretending to be intensely focused on a weed. He knew his place, and it was not to witness the private breakdown of a millionaire. But Sam was just a boy, and he didn't know about those kinds of rules. He just saw a man who was broken, and as he watched, a strange thought began to form in his mind, a thought that started as a simple observation and slowly grew into an idea. He looked at the open door, a dark, square hole in the side of the gleaming house. The crying was pouring out of it, but nothing else was. No sounds of cooking, no television, no music, no voices. It was like the house was a giant, empty box, and the only thing in it was the baby's lonely cry. It was a void of silence, waiting to be filled. Sam's mind drifted back to a few months ago. His baby cousin was staying at their house, and she was going through a fussy phase. One afternoon, she was wailing just like the baby in the big house, her little face red and scrunched up. Nothing would calm her down. Sam's mother had tried everything, rocking her, singing to her, feeding her, but the baby just cried. Then his mother had an idea. She plugged in the old, noisy vacuum cleaner. As soon as she turned it on, letting out a loud, deep, rumbling roar, something amazing happened. The baby's cries faltered. Her eyes went wide, not with fear, but with curiosity. She listened to the low, steady, powerful sound, and within a minute she was quiet, her little body relaxing as she nestled into his mother's shoulder. The vacuum's rumble had soothed her when nothing else could. Sam looked back at the open door of the mansion. Through the glass wall of the office, he could see a large, framed photograph on the wall. It was a picture of a sleek, white private jet, the kind a rich man like Mr. Sterling would own. Sam had always thought it was just a picture of a cool, expensive toy. But now he didn't see the wealth or the status. He thought about the sound that jet would make. A deep, powerful, continuous rumble that would fill the sky. A sound much like the vacuum cleaner, only bigger and stronger. Just then, a low thrumming sound filled the air. Sam looked up. A commercial airliner was making its slow descent toward the airport a few miles away. It was still high in the sky, a tiny silver shape against the blue, but its engines were creating a low, steady, and incredibly deep sound. It wasn't loud or alarming. It was just a constant, powerful presence in the air, a gentle vibration that you could feel in your chest. It was the sound of immense power, but it was also strangely comforting. It was the sound of the engine from the vacuum cleaner, the sound of the jet in the picture, the sound that had calmed his crying cousin, and suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place in Sam's mind. The millionaire had tried everything. He had tried gentle, quiet sounds like rain and heartbeats. He had tried fancy, silent cradles and perfect, quiet rooms. But what if the baby didn't want quiet? What if he didn't want gentle? What if what he really wanted was a deep, steady, powerful rumble? A sound that felt like the world was alive and working around him. A sound that felt like an engine. A sound that felt like a giant, comforting hug for his ears. The baby wasn't crying because there was too much noise. He was crying because there wasn't enough of the right kind of noise. He was all alone in a perfect, silent tomb. And he was scared. Sam looked from the plane in the sky to the broken man on the bench and then to the open door. The idea that was forming in his head felt crazy. Who was he? Just a gardener's son. What did he know about babies, especially the baby of a man like Richard Sterling? He would probably get in trouble. His father would be mad. But as he looked at the man's shaking shoulders and listened to the heartbreaking wail coming from the house, he knew he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He had an idea, a strange and simple idea born from the memory of a vacuum cleaner and the sound of a plane in the sky. And he had a feeling, a deep, certain feeling in his gut, that it might just be the one thing that could finally make the crying stop. Sam's heart was beating like a drum in his chest. The idea that had seemed so clear and simple in his head now felt like the craziest thought in the world. He was just a boy. The man on the bench was a millionaire who owned half the city. He looked at his father, who was still on his knees, his face turned away, pretending to be absorbed in the garden soil. His father knew the rules. You don't bother the boss. You don't speak unless you're spoken to. You do your job and you go home. But Sam couldn't shake the image of the man's shaking shoulders or the sound of the baby's cries, which seemed to be getting even more desperate. He took a deep breath, the air feeling thick in his lungs. He stood up, brushing the grass from his jeans. His legs felt wobbly, like they belonged to someone else. Each step toward the patio was a battle against a voice in his head that screamed at him to turn back. He walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the slumped figure on the bench. The world seemed to shrink until it was just him, the broken man, and the heartbreaking sound pouring from the open door. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard but far enough to not be a threat. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," he said. His own voice was so quiet he was surprised the man even heard it over the baby's wails. Richard. Sterling lifted his head slowly, as if it weighed a ton. His eyes were red-rimmed and vacant. When he saw Sam, a flicker of annoyance crossed his face, quickly replaced by a look of utter confusion. It was as if he was trying to place where this small, dusty boy had come from in his perfectly controlled world. "What?" he asked, his voice rough and scratchy. "I'm busy." The words were meant to be a dismissal, but they came out sounding weak and tired. Sam swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had to say it now. "It's too quiet in your house," he blurted out. The words tumbling out faster than he intended. Richard stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Quiet? Are you deaf? Can't you hear that?" He gestured wildly toward the open door, his hand trembling. Sam nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, I hear the baby, but that's the only thing I hear. It's too quiet otherwise." He took another small step forward, gaining a little confidence from the man's confusion. "My baby sister, when she gets fussy, she likes rumbling sounds, not quiet ones. Like the washing machine or the vacuum cleaner." He paused, letting the strange words hang in the air between them. He knew it sounded crazy. Richard just shook his head, a look of sheer exhaustion on his face. He was about to tell the boy to leave, to go away and leave him to his misery. But something in the boy's calm, serious eyes made him stop. There was no pity there, no judgment. There was just a simple, honest observation. This boy wasn't trying to sell him anything. He wasn't an expert with a fancy degree. He was just a kid who had noticed something. Sam pointed up to the sky, where the plane was now a little lower, its rumble a constant, comforting presence. "Like that," he said softly. "A big, steady, rumbly sound. Your white noise machine? It sounds like water. Maybe he needs an engine." The word engine hung in the air. It was such a strange, mechanical word to use in the context of a crying baby. Richard's logical, data-driven brain immediately rejected it. It was absurd. It was the kind of silly thing a child would say. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on doctors and experts and the most advanced technology in the world. And this boy was telling him the answer was the sound of an engine? But then he looked back at the open door. He looked at his own trembling hands. He had tried everything logical. He had tried everything the experts recommended. And where had it gotten him? It had gotten him to a bench in his own garden, defeated by a 3-month-old baby. He was so far down, so completely broken, that the absurdity of the boy's advice felt like his last, only hope. What did he have to lose? A few more minutes of sanity he didn't have anymore. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last bit of energy from his body, Richard gave a slow, stiff nod. "Fine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Show me." Sam's eyes widened. He hadn't actually expected it to work. He led the way, his sneakers silent on the cool stone of the patio. As they stepped inside the house, the baby's cries hit them like a physical wave. It was so much louder in here, bouncing off the hard, shiny surfaces. Sam followed the sound down a long, empty hallway, his feet sinking slightly into the thick, pristine carpet. He felt out of place, a small, grubby smudge in a world of perfect, clean lines. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and nothing else. It was a house that didn't smell like people lived in it. The sound was coming from a room at the end of the hall. Richard pointed to a door. Sam pushed it open and saw the baby, Leo, lying in a beautiful, modern crib that looked more like a piece of art than a place for a child. The baby's face was red and scrunched up, his tiny fists balled up, his whole body rigid with distress, but Sam's eyes weren't on the baby. They were on the sleek, black sound system sitting on a shelf across the room. He walked over to it, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface. He knew how to work these things. He had one at home, although it was old and scratched. He found the touchscreen display and it lit up with a soft glow. Richard stood in the doorway, watching him with a look of weary skepticism. Sam ignored him. He didn't search for baby sounds or lullabies. He went straight to the internet browser and typed in a simple search, "airplane cabin sound." A list of videos appeared. He scrolled past the short ones and found one that was 10 hours long. The title was simple, 10 hours of airplane cabin ambient noise. The thumbnail showed the inside of an airplane window. He took one last look at the crying baby, then back at the screen. He took a deep breath and pressed the play button. For a second, there was nothing. Then a sound began to fill the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't harsh. It was a low, deep, and steady thrum. It was the sound of a massive engine working far away, a sound of immense, constant power. It was the sound of the plane in the sky, the sound of the vacuum cleaner, the sound of a world that was alive and humming. The sound seemed to seep into the walls, into the floor, into the very air of the silent house in the crib. Something incredible happened. Leo's frantic crying faltered. It didn't stop all at once, but it hitched like a record skipping. His little body, which had been so tense, seemed to unclench just a little. His red, scrunched-up face relaxed and his tear-filled eyes opened wide. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was just listening. He was hearing a sound that was completely different from the gentle, synthesized waves and heartbeats he had been hearing for weeks. This was a real, powerful, and steady sound. It was the sound of an engine. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his own breath caught in his throat. He watched as his son took a shaky, shuddering breath. The baby's frantic movements slowed. His little fists uncurled. He let out one last, soft whimper, a sound of pure relief. Then his heavy eyelids began to droop. The low, steady thrum of the airplane cabin continued to fill the room, a constant, comforting presence. And for the first time in 21 days, Leo's eyes closed and he fell into a deep, peaceful, and utterly silent sleep. Richard stood in the middle of the living room, his body completely still. The silence that had replaced the baby's crying was so profound it felt like a physical presence. It wasn't the empty, sterile silence he was used to, the kind of silence that felt like a vacuum. This was different. This was a warm, heavy, peaceful quiet. It was the silence that comes after a storm has passed, when the air is clean and the world feels new. He could hear his own breathing, slow and deep. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, a sound he had never noticed before. And underneath it all was the low, steady thrum of the airplane cabin noise, a gentle, constant vibration that seemed to make the silence feel safe and complete. He turned his head slowly and looked down the hallway toward the nursery. He couldn't see the crib, but he knew his son was in there, sleeping. Truly sleeping. Not the exhausted, fitful sleep that came after hours of crying, but a deep, restorative sleep. He felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was followed by another feeling, one he was not used to, a sense of complete and utter awe. He looked from the direction of the nursery to the small boy standing quietly by the sound system. Sam was just looking at the floor, as if he had just done something as simple as tying his shoe. For a moment, Richard's old instincts kicked in. His mind, a machine built for transactions, started calculating. This boy had just solved a problem that had cost him tens of thousands of dollars and countless hours of agony. A problem that had defeated the best experts in the world. The logical response was a reward. A big one. He thought about his checkbook, about the numbers he could write on it without a second thought. He could buy this boy's family a new house, a new car. He could set them up for life. It was the most efficient, the most logical solution. It was what he had always done. He threw money at problems until they went away, but as he took a step toward the boy, he stopped. He looked at Sam's dusty sneakers and his worn-out t-shirt. He saw the way the boy's shoulders were slightly hunched, not with fear, but with a quiet shyness. He realized that writing a check would be an insult. It would be a way of saying thank you for your service, now go away. It would be putting a price on something that was, in that moment, truly priceless. It would be a way for Richard to regain control, to turn this incredible human moment back into a simple business transaction. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that that was the wrong thing to do. The old Richard Sterling would have done it without a thought. But the man standing in the quiet, humming living room was no longer that man. He walked over to Sam and crouched down, so he was looking at him eye to eye. It was an unfamiliar position for him, both physically and emotionally. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice soft. He wasn't asking for data or a logical explanation. He was genuinely asking from a place of deep curiosity and humility. Sam looked up, surprised by the question. He shrugged, a small, awkward movement. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It's just, at my house, it's never really quiet. There's always something making a low noise. The TV is on, or the washing machine is going, or my mom is singing while she cooks. My baby cousin, she likes that. She calms down when she hears the rumbling. It feels safe, like she's not alone. Your house is so quiet. It's like a library." I think the baby was just scared because he was all alone in the quiet. Richard listened to every word. He wasn't just hearing the words. He was understanding the meaning behind them. His house was a library, a museum, a place for things, not for people. He had designed it that way, thinking that order and quiet were the ultimate forms of comfort. He had been so wrong. He had tried to give his son a perfect, sterile environment, when all the baby wanted was the messy, rumbling comfort of a real, lived-in home. He had been trying to solve a human problem with a machine's logic. The next morning, Richard did something he had never done before. He walked out of his front gate past the manicured hedges, and up the cracked sidewalk to the small, weathered bungalow next door. He knocked on the screen door, which was propped open with a worn-out baseball. Sam's father answered, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes wide with surprise to see his boss standing on his porch. Richard didn't stand there like a king addressing a subject. He stepped inside, looking around the small, cluttered home with new eyes. He saw the piles of books, the drawings taped to the wall, the smell of bacon and coffee lingering in the air. He saw the life that filled this small space, the life he had been missing in his own giant house. He didn't just offer Sam's father a new job. He sat with him at his kitchen table, and he thanked him. He thanked him for his hard work over the years, and he thanked him for raising a son with such a wise and kind heart. He offered him a position as the head of estate management, a job with a salary and benefits that would ensure his family would never have to worry about money again. Then he turned to Sam, who was sitting at the table, trying to look invisible. He told Sam he was setting up a trust fund for his education, a fund that would pay for any college in the world so he could follow his dreams, whether they were in art or engineering or anything else he could imagine. But the most important thing Richard did that day was ask for one more thing. He looked at Sam and said, "I think you have more to teach me. Would you be willing to help me learn how to listen?" Life in the Sterling mansion began to change. The low, steady hum of the airplane cabin became its new soundtrack. It played softly in the background, a constant comforting presence. Richard started spending his days not in his office, but on the floor of the nursery, playing with his son. He learned the difference between a cry of hunger and a cry of boredom. He learned that Leo loved the sound of him turning the pages of a magazine or the soft crinkle of a plastic wrapper. He even started leaving the windows open during the day, so the sounds of the gardener working, the birds singing, and the distant traffic could drift in. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the gentle, messy, beautiful sounds of life. Richard had learned a lesson that no amount of money could have ever bought him. He had learned that true wealth wasn't in a bank account or a stock portfolio. It was in the quiet wisdom of a child, in the gentle hum of a home filled with love, and in the humility to admit that you don't have all the answers. The sound of the airplane, which had once been just a symbol of his success, had become something more. It was a reminder of the day a poor boy from next door taught a powerful millionaire that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't put a price on. And as he held his sleeping son in his arms, listening to the low, steady thrum that filled his home, Richard Sterling finally felt like the richest man in the world.